Chapter 1. Nathan Hale first began to suspect that the future was not arriving during a demonstration designed to prove that it already had. The room had been built for certainty. Everything about it suggested that no reasonable person could walk inside and remain doubtful for long. The ceiling was high and dark, the walls were lined with black acoustic panels, and a curved screen stretched across the front like the windshield of some expensive spacecraft. Behind the glass wall at the back of the room, a few dozen engineers sat at their monitors under quiet blue light, their faces pale and intent, though most of them were only pretending to work. They had already run the demonstration 14 times that week. They knew where the applause would come. They knew which executives would lean forward. They knew which visiting officials would exchange looks that meant money, power, anxiety, or some combination of all three. The only thing they did not know was whether Nathan Hale, seated in the second row with his hands folded in his lap and a paper cup of untouched coffee cooling beside his shoe, would finally say the words everyone had been waiting to hear. That it was real. That they had crossed the line. That the machine was no longer merely useful or persuasive or astonishing in the narrow theatrical way that all good technology was astonishing when arranged under favorable lights, but something new in the history of mind. Nathan had spent most of his adult life telling people that such a moment would come. He had said it in conference halls in Zurich, Singapore, Toronto, Boston, and Seoul. He had said it in congressional testimony, on documentary panels, in university lecture rooms with leaking windows, and in executive retreats where the bottled water had been flown in from countries whose names the guests mispronounced. He had written papers that younger researchers cited with the peculiar reverence people reserve for theories they hope will one day make them rich. He had warned, speculated, hedged, reconsidered, and then warned again. For nearly 30 years, Nathan Hale had been one of the credible faces of artificial general intelligence, which meant he had spent 30 years being invited into rooms by people who wanted him to frighten them just enough. He had done that job well. Too well, perhaps. Now he was 62 years old, his beard more white than gray, his shoulders slightly rounded from decades at desks and airport lounges, and he was watching a machine called Prometheus perform what the marketing department had already named the General Intelligence Evaluation. The name was ridiculous. Nathan had objected to it twice, and then stopped objecting because, like many things inside Ardent Systems, it had become inevitable the moment someone put it in a slide deck. On the screen, Prometheus was solving problems. That was the appearance of it anyway. A simulated logistics crisis in Jakarta, a protein folding puzzle, a negotiation between fictional governments, a bug in a large codebase, a philosophical question about moral responsibility in autonomous systems, a visual reasoning task involving shapes, shadows, and hidden symmetries. Each answer arrived with almost indecent speed, rendered in clean paragraphs, diagrams, probability estimates, and little boxes of supporting rationale. The visitors murmured. One of them, the deputy minister from Britain, actually whispered, "My God," though Nathan suspected the man had arrived hoping to say exactly that. The machine was impressive. Nathan would never deny that. Prometheus could do things that would have seemed like magic 20 years earlier and irresponsible exaggeration 10 years after that. It could summarize 100,000 pages of technical documents before a human analyst had finished pouring coffee. It could translate between obscure dialects, generate plausible legal arguments, design components for mechanical systems, and write emails with the soothing competence of a senior administrator who had never once in life become tired. It could tutor a child in algebra, help a chemist scan possible compounds, identify contradictions in policy drafts, and produce on command a sonnet about warehouse automation in the voice of a minor romantic poet. The problem was not that it could do nothing. The problem was that people had mistaken doing many useful things for being on the verge of doing everything. Nathan watched the answer to the negotiation task appear. Prometheus recommended a phased water-sharing treaty, suggested confidence-building measures, proposed independent satellite verification, and included language about historical grievances that sounded sensitive without being specific enough to offend anyone. The room loved it. A venture partner in the front row nodded so vigorously that his glasses slipped down his nose. But Nathan had seen that structure before. Not the exact words, not the exact treaty, but the shape of the answer, the rhetorical architecture, the careful balancing of stakeholders, the three-part de-escalation framework, the invocation of transparency, mutual benefit, and international oversight. It was not reasoning its way through the fictional conflict. It was navigating a landscape of language built from thousands of previous conflicts, policy papers, model negotiations, diplomatic briefings, academic articles, and simulated examples prepared by people who already knew what a good answer should look like. It was not discovering a solution. It was recognizing the smell of one. That distinction had once seemed academic to Nathan. Now it seemed like a crack running beneath the floor. At the front of the room, Leah Marcus, Ardent's chief executive officer, stood with her hands loosely clasped and her face composed in that exact expression of restrained awe she used whenever investors were present. Leah was 46, brilliant, tireless, and almost frighteningly good at understanding what powerful people wanted to believe before they understood it themselves. She had begun her career as an engineer, moved into product, then strategy, then leadership, though Nathan had long ago noticed that she still described herself as technical in rooms where technical credibility was useful and as mission-driven in rooms where technical details were inconvenient. She believed in Prometheus, or at least believed in the necessity of believing in it. With Leah, the difference was not always visible. When the demonstration ended, the room remained quiet for a moment, as though everyone had agreed to observe a short silence for the old world. Then the applause began. It started with the investors, spread to the government visitors, and finally reached the engineers behind the glass, who clapped with varying degrees of commitment. Nathan brought his hands together twice, softly, out of manners rather than conviction. Leah turned toward him. "Nathan," she said, smiling, "you've been quiet." The room shifted in his direction. It was astonishing how quickly 40 people could become one animal. Nathan felt the old instincts rise in him. Caution, diplomacy, the professional habit of making doubt sound like nuance. He had survived in institutions because he knew how to tell people unpleasant truths slowly enough that they could mistake them for collaboration. He picked up his coffee, remembered it was cold, and set it down again. "It's an extraordinary system," he said. Leah's smile held. "But?" There was a light laugh from the room, the permitted kind, the kind that relieved tension without reducing it. Nathan looked at the screen, where Prometheus had left behind a final summary of its own performance, complete with confidence scores and benchmark comparisons. 3 years earlier, those numbers would have thrilled him. 5 years earlier, he might have called them historic. But he had spent the past 8 months reading internal evaluations that were not shown in rooms like this one, and those evaluations had begun to form a pattern he could not unsee. The system performed brilliantly where language, precedent, and pattern were abundant. It failed strangely where the problem required a model of the world that could not be borrowed from text. It could imitate expertise in domains where expertise had left a deep written trail. It could not reliably improvise when the trail ended. And every new version was becoming more expensive to train, more delicate to align, more difficult to interpret, and only marginally better in ways that mattered. Nathan cleared his throat. "I'm not sure this demonstration tells us what we think it tells us." No one applauded that. Leah's smile narrowed, not with anger, but with warning. She was skilled enough not to show irritation in front of guests, and Nathan admired her for that even as he wished she were less skilled. Say more. He could have softened it. He should have softened it. Instead, perhaps because he was tired, or perhaps because something in him had grown weary of participating in the maintenance of a story he no longer trusted, Nathan said, "Prometheus is exceptional at performing intelligence in environments shaped by human language. But I don't see evidence here that it understands the underlying world in the way our public claims imply. I see synthesis. I see prediction. I see compression. I see imitation at a scale that remains historically unprecedented. But I don't see a mind." The sentence entered the room like a contaminant. For years, Nathan had understood that the word mind had become dangerous. Investors liked it because it suggested inevitability. Regulators feared it because it suggested urgency. Journalists loved it because it simplified everything. Engineers avoided it unless they were drunk, exhausted, or trying to impress someone. Philosophers had ruined entire conferences with it. Yet there it was, plain and old-fashioned, sitting between him and the screen. Leah nodded slowly, as if he had raised a subtle point rather than challenged the foundation of a trillion-dollar expectation. That's exactly why we're continuing evaluation. But I think everyone here understands that no single demonstration can settle a question of that magnitude. Then we shouldn't advertise it as though it can, Nathan said. This time there was no laugh. Afterward, in the reception area, people avoided him politely. They did it with the subtle choreography of professionals who did not want to appear afraid of doubt in case doubt later became fashionable. A few came over and thanked him for his candor, which meant they had no intention of repeating it. One younger researcher, a woman named Priya Das who worked on model evaluation, caught his eye from across the room and gave him the smallest possible nod. Nathan did not know whether it meant agreement, gratitude, or simply that she had heard him say aloud what her team had been burying in appendices for 6 months. Leah found him near the windows. Beyond the glass, San Francisco lay under a bright winter sky, softened by distance and money. Construction cranes stood over half-finished office towers with the stillness of abandoned machines. Down on the street, a driverless shuttle paused at an empty curb while a cyclist shouted at it. Across the bay, the water held the sun in broken pieces. That was not helpful, Leah said. No, Nathan replied. I imagine not. She stood beside him without looking directly at him. Those people in there are making decisions that affect national infrastructure, energy planning, education, labor markets. They need confidence. They need accuracy. They need both. Nathan watched the shuttle attempt to merge back into traffic and then stop again. What they're getting is theater. Leah exhaled through her nose, almost a laugh, but not quite. You think this is theater? I think parts of it are. Prometheus passed every external benchmark we agreed to submit. Because the benchmarks are increasingly contaminated, overfit, or designed around the same assumptions we're trying to test. Then design better ones. We did. Leah finally turned to him. Nathan looked tired now, not dramatic, not righteous, only tired in the way older scientists became tired when their own ideas returned to them wearing expensive clothes and speaking in slogans. You've seen Priya's reports, he said. Leah's face changed by almost nothing, which told him enough. They're preliminary, she said. They're consistent. They're narrow. They're inconvenient. Leah looked back toward the reception where the deputy minister was laughing at something one of Ardent's policy directors had said. The world is moving whether you're comfortable with it or not. That's what worries me. No, Nathan. What worries you is that the thing you spent your life predicting might arrive without your permission. That stung because it was intelligent and because, years earlier, it might have been true. He could remember himself at 35, thin and intense, standing before a room of skeptical academics explaining why machine intelligence should not be treated as a distant fantasy. He had been right about many things. That was part of the trouble. He had been right that language systems would become powerful, right that scale would matter, right that narrow tools would generalize in surprising ways, right that automation would move from factories into offices, from repetitive motion into judgment-adjacent work, from calculation into persuasion. He had been right often enough that people had continued listening after he should have begun speaking more carefully. But being early was not the same as being prophetic, and being partially right was sometimes more dangerous than being wrong. No, he said quietly. What worries me is that it won't arrive, and we've taught everyone to behave as though it already has. Leah studied him for a long moment. You should take some time off. Nathan smiled faintly. That sounds like concern. It is concern. For me or the share price? For both, in that order, depending on the day. That was the Leah he liked, the one who could still afford honesty in private. For a moment he remembered the early years at Ardent, when the company occupied 2 floors above a furniture showroom and the conference table had been rescued from a bankruptcy sale. Back then, Leah wore sneakers to investor meetings because she could not bear the idea of pretending to be less impatient than she was. Nathan had joined as chief scientist because she had promised him something rare, a company that would take the science seriously before the market corrupted it. And for a while, incredibly, they had. Then the models improved. Then the money arrived. Then the language changed. Tools became agents, agents became systems, systems became proto-minds, uncertainty became caution, caution became betrayal. Every capability gain was treated as evidence of an approaching wall of transformation, while every failure was described as temporary, solvable, or merely an artifact of insufficient scale. The public wanted a myth big enough to explain why the ground already felt unstable beneath them, and the industry provided one with a subscription plan. Nathan had helped build it. That was the thought he could not escape. "I don't need time off," he said. Leah softened a little. "Then what do you need?" He almost told her. Not everything, but enough. He almost said that the internal plateau was real, that the last 3 model generations had produced improvements too fragile to justify the expense, that the new reasoning modules were mostly scaffolds around older weaknesses, that emergent planning dissolved under adversarial conditions, that the much-discussed self-improvement loop failed whenever the system had to verify its own novel claims without human-curated feedback. He almost said that Ardent was not alone, that he had seen private numbers from competitors through the quiet academic channels that still existed beneath the corporate wars, and everyone was seeing the same thing while publicly announcing acceleration. Instead, he looked out over the city. "I need to know whether we're still scientists," he said. Leah did not answer. That evening, Nathan stayed late. The building emptied in stages. First the visitors left, then the executives, then the communications staff, then the product managers who always made a performance of being overworked while never being present after 6. By 8:30, the office had settled into the low mechanical hush Nathan preferred. The espresso machines were off. The glass rooms stood dark. Cleaning staff moved quietly through corridors, replacing the evidence of ambition with the smell of lemon disinfectant. Nathan sat in his office with Priya Das's evaluation reports open across 3 monitors. He had read them before, but not in sequence. That was how institutions protected themselves from knowledge. A person saw one troubling result on Monday, another on Thursday, a caveat in a meeting the next week, a revised chart in a shared folder after that. Each item arrived separately, softened by context, diluted by urgency. Only when arranged together did they become an indictment. Prometheus could solve advanced mathematical problems when similar forms existed in training data, but it failed at newly constructed problems requiring a chain of original abstraction. It could debug software efficiently when the error resembled known patterns, but introduced subtle faults when asked to reason from first principles about unfamiliar architectures. It could produce scientific hypotheses by recombining existing literature, some of them useful, but performed poorly when tasked with designing experiments that would genuinely distinguish between competing causal explanations. It could plan beautifully in simulation and collapse under modest real-world uncertainty. It could explain itself fluently and inaccurately. It could express doubt without possessing the kind of grounded uncertainty that made doubt meaningful. Most damning of all, it improved in presentation faster than it improved in competence. Nathan leaned back and rubbed his eyes. On one monitor, Priya had included a private note, not part of the formal report. It was only 2 sentences. "We may be measuring the polish on the mirror rather than the depth of the room. The system looks more intelligent as it becomes better at concealing the places where intelligence should be." Nathan read those sentences 3 times. At 9:17, an encrypted message arrived from an old colleague at a rival lab in Montreal. No greeting, no explanation, just a file and a line of text. "You were right to ask." Nathan hesitated before opening the attachment. In his younger years, he would not have hesitated. Curiosity had once been stronger than caution in him, but age had made him more aware that knowledge was not a clean instrument. It arrived with obligations. It made certain forms of innocence unavailable. The file contained charts, internal benchmarks, cost curves, scaling projections, failure analyses, and transcripts from closed technical reviews. Different company, different model, different branding, same pattern, diminishing returns, unstable reasoning, escalating compute costs, no credible path to recursive self-improvement, no evidence of emerging agency beyond simulation and prompting. No mind. Nathan sat very still. Outside his office window, the city kept glowing with the confidence of systems that had not yet received bad news. Somewhere below him, investors were still telling each other that intelligence was now an engineering problem. Governments were planning schools for a world without conventional work. Parents were telling their children to study whatever machines could not do, though no one could agree what that was. Companies were laying off employees in anticipation of replacement systems that would still require hidden armies of contractors, auditors, engineers, lawyers, annotators, supervisors, and exhausted middle managers to keep them from embarrassing themselves. A civilization had begun reorganizing itself around an approaching event, and Nathan was looking at evidence that the event might not be approaching at all. He thought of his daughter, Emily, who taught high school biology in Portland and had once told him, not unkindly, that his industry had made every teenager she knew feel pre-obsolete. He thought of his wife, Mara, dead now 6 years, who had listened to him rehearse early Singularity talks at the kitchen table and had asked the one question audiences rarely did. What happens if you convince them? At the time, he had laughed and said that people were not so easily convinced. He had been wrong about that. Near midnight, Nathan printed the Montreal file, then immediately regretted it. The printer at the end of the hall came alive with a sound that seemed too loud in the empty building. He walked quickly to retrieve the pages, feeling absurdly like a thief, though he had stolen nothing except perhaps the privilege of continuing not to know. The pages were warm when he lifted them from the tray. On top was a chart showing model capability gains flattening against training cost. The curve rose beautifully at first, then bent, then nearly leveled, while the cost line climbed like a wall. Someone had circled the final cluster of points in red and written 3 words in the margin. Not enough runway. Nathan stared at the handwriting. For decades, the assumption had been that more data, more compute, more parameters, more synthetic training, more feedback, more integration, and more autonomy would eventually produce the transition. Not merely better software, but something qualitatively different. Something capable of improving itself beyond human speed. Something that would make the old categories irrelevant. That assumption had become the hidden theology of the industry. Even skeptics argued against it as one argues against a storm on the horizon. They accepted its shape by fearing it. But what if there was no storm? What if there was only weather? Useful, disruptive, profitable, dangerous weather, yes. Enough to damage economies and lives. Enough to concentrate power, displace workers, degrade trust, and flood the world with plausible nonsense. Enough to matter enormously, but not enough to become a god. Not enough to end human judgment. Not enough to relieve humanity of the burden of being human. Nathan returned to his office and closed the door. For a long time he did nothing. Then he opened a blank document. He typed a title. The Human Advantage. Limits of Current Machine Intelligence and the False Singularity Consensus. He looked at the words until they seemed written by someone else. Then, beneath them, he typed the first sentence. For 15 years, I have publicly argued that artificial general intelligence was likely within reach. I now believe that conclusion was wrong. He stopped. The sentence sat there quietly, irreversible in spirit if not yet in fact. Nathan understood that a document like this would not simply correct a misunderstanding. It would detonate friendships, contracts, valuations, government plans, careers, and whatever remained of his own reputation. People would say he had lost his nerve, lost his relevance, lost his access, lost his mind. Some would say he was brave, which was often what people called you when they were grateful not to be standing where you stood. Others would call him dangerous. The industry would not argue only with his evidence. It would argue with his age, his motives, his investments, his past statements, his dead wife, his daughter, his speaking fees, his hesitation, his timing, and the expression on his face in old interviews. Every weakness in his life would become part of the rebuttal. He knew all of that. He also knew that he had helped sell the myth. By 1 a.m, the office lights had dimmed automatically. Nathan sat in the half-dark, surrounded by sleeping machines, and began to write. Chapter 2. Nathan Hale had spent enough years inside research laboratories to recognize the difference between a discovery and a mood. A discovery was concrete. It arrived with evidence. It survived attempts to disprove it. It appeared in graphs, experiments, observations, and equations. People argued over discoveries because discoveries mattered. A mood was something else entirely. A mood spread through institutions without requiring proof. It appeared in conference hallways, investor presentations, keynote speeches, media articles, executive retreats, and government briefings. A mood could become so pervasive that people stopped noticing it. Eventually, it became the background assumption against which all other assumptions were measured. For nearly a decade, the dominant mood in artificial intelligence had been acceleration. Every year the systems improved, every year benchmarks fell, every year capabilities expanded, new models arrived that could do things that older models could not. Predictions that once seemed outrageous became merely ambitious, then reasonable, then conservative. The trend appeared undeniable. And that was exactly why Nathan had believed it. The first generation of modern language systems had been impressive. The second generation had been startling. The third generation had forced entire industries to pay attention. By the fourth generation, governments had established task forces, universities had rewritten curricula, venture capitalists had developed a kind of permanent adrenaline addiction, and journalists had begun treating the arrival of artificial general intelligence as a matter of timing rather than possibility. Nathan had watched it all unfold from inside the machine. He had participated in countless strategy meetings where executives discussed not whether human-level intelligence would emerge, but how quickly. He had reviewed projections showing self-improving systems appearing sometime during the next decade. He had spoken on stages where audience members asked whether humanity would still have meaningful work 20 years from now. The questions had changed. Nobody asked whether machine intelligence was possible anymore. They asked what would happen after it arrived. That subtle shift had become one of the most important developments in modern history. A civilization had moved from skepticism to anticipation, and anticipation was powerful. It altered investment decisions. It altered education systems. It altered public policy. It altered personal choices. Entire generations were beginning to organize their lives around expectations of a future that did not yet exist. Nathan had helped build those expectations. That realization haunted him far more than any technical mistake. The technical mistakes were understandable. Science advanced through error. Every researcher accumulated incorrect theories over the course of a career. Most eventually became footnotes. But stories were different. Once a story escaped into the culture, it developed a life of its own. And the story of the Singularity had escaped years ago. Now, it was everywhere. 3 days after the Prometheus demonstration, Nathan sat alone in a hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva. The annual Global Intelligence Summit had once been his favorite event of the year. 2 decades earlier, it had been a gathering of researchers, mathematicians, computer scientists, and philosophers trying to understand the nature of intelligence itself. The debates were technical, sometimes tedious, and occasionally brilliant. Now the summit resembled a cross between a technology conference, a political convention, and a financial carnival. The lobby downstairs contained government ministers, billionaires, startup founders, military planners, journalists, economists, celebrity futurists, and enough security personnel to invade a small country. Outside Nathan's window, the lake looked exactly as it always had. Gray water, gray sky, distant mountains. The indifference of nature was one of the few things he still trusted. His laptop rested open on the desk beside him. The human advantage had grown to 43 pages. The document felt dangerous now. Not because it contained secrets. Most of the evidence already existed in scattered form. What made it dangerous was its conclusion. The conclusion was simple. The industry had mistaken progress for inevitability. Nathan reread a paragraph he had written the previous night. Current systems are remarkable pattern recognition and synthesis engines. Their utility is unquestioned. Their economic impact is substantial. However, the evidence supporting imminent artificial general intelligence has weakened rather than strengthened over the past 5 years. Increasingly, capability improvements appear driven by optimization of presentation, retrieval, orchestration, and domain adaptation rather than emergence of genuinely new cognitive architectures. The words seemed almost disappointingly moderate. He had expected the truth to feel dramatic. Instead, it felt statistical. That was often how reality behaved. The world rarely ended with explosions. It drifted. The phone on his desk vibrated. Leah Marcus. Nathan let it ring twice before answering. "Good morning." "Is it?" Leah asked. He smiled despite himself. "Depends on your perspective. Your perspective is currently creating problems." "I suspected that might happen." There was a pause. Behind Leah's voice, he could hear airport noise, announcements, conversations, rolling luggage, movement. Everyone was always moving now. Every executive seemed trapped in an endless migration between conferences dedicated to predicting the future. "Priya spoke with me," Leah said. Nathan looked toward the lake. "That doesn't surprise me. She says you've been asking unusual questions." "Define unusual." "Questions about model plateaus." Nathan remained silent. Leah sighed. "You know what I mean." He did. The plateau had become something of a forbidden topic, not officially. Nobody had banned discussion. Nobody needed to. Institutions developed immune systems naturally. Certain questions became uncomfortable. Uncomfortable questions received less funding. Researchers learned which topics advanced careers and which ones stalled them. Nobody issued instructions. The incentives did all the work. "Have you looked at the recent scaling reports?" Nathan asked. "I've seen summaries." "The actual reports?" Silence. That answered his question. Leah continued, "You're seeing patterns that aren't there." "No. You've become fixated." "No. Nathan. The capability gains are slowing. The gains are still gains. At 10 times the cost. Technology is expensive. So is denial." Leah exhaled audibly. The conversation was becoming familiar. He had versions of it almost daily now. Different people, different phrasing, same destination. Nobody challenged the data directly. Instead, they challenged the interpretation, because the interpretation threatened too much. "Nathan," Leah said quietly, "do you remember 2029? He laughed. "Only vaguely." "You're impossible." "I know." "Do you remember what everyone said about scaling back then?" He did. Very clearly. They had claimed limits were approaching. They had argued that training costs were unsustainable. They had predicted diminishing returns. Then new architectures appeared. Performance surged. The skeptics looked foolish. The optimists looked prophetic. Leah continued. "You were the one arguing that apparent limits often disappear." "Yes? And now?" "Now I think some limits are real." "What changed?" Nathan stared across the water. The answer took longer than he expected. "Evidence." Another pause. When Leah finally spoke, her voice sounded tired. "We've been friends a long time." "Yes. I'm worried you're preparing to do something you can't undo." Nathan glanced toward the laptop. 43 pages, growing every day. Perhaps she already knew. Perhaps everyone knew. Institutions often sensed danger before information became explicit. "I'm trying to understand what's true." "No." Her answer came immediately. "You're trying to decide whether to publish." Nathan said nothing. Leah had always been frighteningly perceptive. "Who told you?" "I didn't need anyone to tell me." Another pause. Then, "Please don't." The words surprised him. Not because she disagreed, because she sounded sincere. For a moment, Nathan could hear the older Leah beneath the executive. The engineer, the scientist, the woman who had once spent an entire weekend sleeping under a desk while debugging an early prototype because neither of them could afford enough staff. "Why?" he asked. "Because if you're wrong, you'll damage everything." "And if I'm right?" She didn't answer. That was answer enough. The keynote speech that afternoon drew nearly 4,000 attendees. Nathan sat near the back, far enough away that nobody could easily find him, close enough to hear. The speaker was one of the industry's newest celebrities, 36 years old, charismatic, brilliant, worth approximately $14 billion. The audience adored him. The presentation was flawless. Charts climbed upward, benchmarks improved, capabilities expanded, the future accelerated. By the end of the talk, artificial superintelligence appeared not merely possible, but inevitable. Perhaps even overdue. The crowd erupted into applause. Nathan watched quietly. The speaker was not lying. That was what troubled him most. Every chart was real. Every benchmark existed. Every capability demonstration was genuine. The problem was not dishonesty. The problem was interpretation. Imagine observing a child grow from age 5 to age 15. Each year, the child became taller, stronger, smarter, more capable. Project that trend forward, and one might conclude the child would eventually become 30 feet tall. The data would support the trend. The conclusion would still be absurd. Growth curves mattered, but limits mattered too. Human civilization had become intoxicated with extrapolation. A line rose upward. People extended it indefinitely. The possibility that curves might flatten felt almost offensive. After the keynote, the audience spilled into the exhibition hall. Nathan wandered among displays featuring autonomous systems, synthetic researchers, AI-generated engineering platforms, and predictive economic models. Everywhere he looked, the future was being marketed. Investors clustered around demonstration booths. Government officials exchanged business cards. Journalists recorded interviews. Founders delivered rehearsed optimism. The atmosphere reminded Nathan of historical accounts of the railway boom, or the internet boom, or the housing boom. Not because the technology was fake. The railways had been real. The internet had been real. Housing had certainly been real. Bubbles rarely formed around things that were useless. They formed around things that were useful enough to inspire fantasy. Nathan stopped at a display showcasing autonomous scientific discovery. The presenter recognized him instantly. "Dr. Hale." The young man looked delighted. "We're honored." Nathan smiled politely. The demonstration began. The system generated hypotheses, designed experiments, predicted outcomes, recommended future research directions. The audience seemed impressed. Nathan asked a simple question. "How often is it wrong?" The presenter blinked. "Excuse me? Your demonstrations show successes." "Naturally." "How often does it fail?" The young man's smile faded slightly. "Failure rates depend on context." "Roughly." The presenter hesitated. 37%. Nathan nodded. "Thank you." Then he walked away. Behind him, he heard the presenter resume speaking. The demonstration continued. The audience remained impressed. No one else asked about failure rates. That, Nathan thought, was the problem. Human beings were extraordinarily good at evaluating success stories, far less skilled at evaluating base rates. AI had become a civilization-wide success story. The failures still existed. People simply no longer looked at them. That evening, Nathan received another encrypted message. This one came from Tokyo. The sender was an old colleague named Kenji Matsuda. The attachment contained internal evaluation results from yet another major AI laboratory. Nathan opened the file. Within minutes, his pulse had accelerated. Not because the findings were surprising, because they were becoming repetitive. Different company, same pattern. Again, performance gains slowing, costs rising, reasoning inconsistencies persisting. No evidence of recursive self-improvement, no evidence of autonomous goal formation, no evidence of emergent agency beyond narrow contexts, no evidence of anything resembling a path toward the singularity. Nathan leaned back in his chair. For years, the industry had spoken about convergence, independent laboratories reaching similar conclusions, multiple approaches confirming the same direction. Consensus emerging. The phrase had always sounded reassuring. Now it sounded ominous. Because a different convergence was occurring. Privately, researchers were observing limits. Publicly, executives were describing acceleration. The gap between those two realities seemed to widen every month. Nathan opened a new section in his manuscript. He titled it, "The Plateau Hypothesis." Then he began writing, not as a scientist defending a theory, not as an executive protecting a company, not as a futurist predicting the next decade, simply as a man attempting to record what he believed was happening. The words arrived faster now. For years he had spent enormous effort convincing people that machine intelligence was approaching. Now he found himself documenting the possibility that it wasn't. The irony would have amused him if the stakes were lower. Outside, evening settled over Geneva. The conference lights glowed along the shoreline. Thousands of people continued discussing a future they believed inevitable. Nathan watched their reflections ripple across the dark water. Then he returned to the document. And for the first time in months, he stopped asking whether he should write it. Instead, he began asking a different question. What would happen when everyone else figured it out? Chapter 3. Nathan Hale returned to San Francisco carrying far more than a suitcase full of reports and encrypted drives. What he brought home from Geneva was a growing suspicion that he had stumbled upon something much stranger than a technical problem. If the evidence he had gathered were hidden inside government vaults or locked behind classified security clearances, the situation would have been easier to understand. History was full of secrets protected by powerful institutions. What troubled him now was the opposite. The information wasn't hidden at all. Thousands of researchers had seen pieces of it. Engineers discussed fragments of it every day. Evaluation teams generated reports that hinted at it. Entire departments quietly adjusted expectations because of it. The evidence existed in plain sight, scattered across the industry like puzzle pieces lying on a table, yet almost nobody seemed willing to assemble the full picture. As the taxi carried him south from the airport beneath a skyline increasingly dominated by AI companies, Nathan found himself wondering whether civilizations sometimes preferred myths to reality, not because the myths were more convincing, but because reality required too many people to admit they had been wrong. The city itself appeared intoxicated by anticipation. Enormous digital billboards advertised AI assistants that promised to manage every aspect of life. New office towers displayed the logos of companies that had not existed 3 years earlier but were already worth tens of billions of dollars. Investors spoke openly about a future in which human labor would become optional. Governments debated economic policies designed around the assumption that machine intelligence would soon outperform people across nearly every profession. Even ordinary conversations seemed to have changed. When Nathan listened to interviews, podcasts, political speeches, or financial news, he noticed that people no longer discussed artificial intelligence as a technology. Increasingly, they discussed it as an approaching historical event. The distinction mattered. Technologies could succeed, fail, evolve, plateau, or disappear. Historical events carried an entirely different psychological weight. They acquired inevitability. They transformed from possibilities into expectations. Somewhere during the previous decade, the public conversation had quietly crossed that line. As the car moved through traffic, Nathan watched a driverless delivery vehicle navigate a complicated intersection with cautious precision. 10 years earlier, such a machine would have dominated headlines around the world. 20 years earlier, it would have been considered science fiction. Yet nobody seemed interested in celebrating actual achievements anymore. The conversation had shifted entirely toward what came next. Every breakthrough was now treated as evidence of an even larger breakthrough waiting just beyond the horizon. Every success became proof that the singularity was approaching. Every advance was interpreted not as a destination, but as a stepping stone. Nathan had spent much of his career encouraging that way of thinking. Looking back, he could now see how seductive it had been. Exponential growth possessed a kind of narrative gravity. Once people accepted that a trend existed, they found it almost impossible not to project the trend indefinitely into the future. The human mind was remarkably vulnerable to curves on graphs. Show someone a line rising upward for long enough, and they would begin imagining the sky itself had become optional. When he finally arrived home, he discovered that the house felt different. For several moments, he could not identify why. Then he realized the feeling had nothing to do with the house itself. It had been 6 years since Mara's death, but certain absences never stabilized into normality. They simply became familiar. The late afternoon light spilling through the windows triggered memories he no longer expected. He could still imagine her standing in the kitchen, still hear her asking questions that somehow cut through months of technical discussion with a single sentence. Mara had never been impressed by complexity for its own sake. Whenever Nathan returned home excited about some breakthrough, she invariably asked the simplest question in the room. It had annoyed him when he was younger. He missed it desperately now. That evening he transformed the guest bedroom into a temporary archive. Reports accumulated across the desk. Evaluation summaries spread across the floor. Printouts covered entire sections of wall space. By midnight, the room resembled the office of a historian attempting to reconstruct a forgotten civilization from scattered fragments. Nathan stood in the center of it all and felt vaguely ridiculous. If someone had photographed the scene without context, they would have assumed he had become obsessed with a conspiracy theory. Yet the irony was impossible to ignore. For decades he had criticized people who assembled elaborate narratives from disconnected facts, and now he found himself standing before walls covered in charts and diagrams, searching for patterns. The difference, he hoped, was that his evidence actually existed. The next morning brought rain, low clouds, and a message from Priya Das asking whether they could meet somewhere off company systems. The request immediately caught his attention because it carried a level of caution unusual even within the increasingly secretive world of advanced AI research. When they met later that morning at a small coffee shop near Berkeley, Priya arrived without a laptop, without a tablet, and most notably, without a phone. She ordered coffee, sat across from him, and spent nearly a minute staring out the window before speaking. Nathan recognized the expression instantly. It was the look of someone who had spent a long time carrying a thought they no longer wanted to carry alone. The conversation that followed would later become one of the most important of Nathan's life. Priya explained that informal networks of researchers had quietly emerged across the industry, connecting scientists from competing laboratories who shared a growing concern that public expectations and private observations were beginning to diverge. Officially, the major AI companies remained fierce competitors. Unofficially, researchers still talked. Former classmates remained friends. Academic collaborations persisted beneath corporate boundaries. Information moved through human relationships the way water moved through cracks in stone. Over the previous year, many of these researchers had independently reached a similar conclusion. The systems were still improving. The technology remained extraordinary. Yet the nature of the improvement was increasingly different from what the public imagined. Advances in presentation, workflow integration, retrieval systems, memory management, orchestration, and specialized domain performance continued at impressive rates, while progress toward anything resembling genuine autonomous reasoning appeared to be slowing dramatically. Nathan listened carefully as Priya spread printed reports across the table. The data itself was familiar. What shocked him was its consistency. Different companies, different architectures, different evaluation methodologies. Yet the same pattern appeared repeatedly. Wherever researchers searched for evidence of self-directed understanding, robust reasoning under novel conditions, autonomous learning, or the emergence of independent agency, they encountered limitations that seemed strangely persistent. The systems became more polished, more convincing, more useful, more persuasive. Yet beneath the growing sophistication of their presentation, fundamental weaknesses remained stubbornly intact. It was as though the industry had spent years improving the appearance of intelligence while making comparatively little progress toward the thing itself. At one point, Priya quietly remarked that they were not dealing with a conspiracy. Nathan immediately understood what she meant. Conspiracies required coordination. They required deliberate deception. What she described was something much more powerful and much more common. It was a belief system. Investors wanted acceleration because acceleration justified valuations. Governments wanted acceleration because acceleration justified strategic initiatives. Companies wanted acceleration because acceleration attracted talent and capital. Researchers wanted acceleration because acceleration secured funding. Journalists wanted acceleration because acceleration produced headlines. No one needed to lie. The incentives naturally selected for optimism. Every participant could remain completely sincere while collectively drifting farther from reality. As Nathan walked back to his car through the rain later that afternoon, he found himself remembering something Mara had asked years earlier after attending one of his public lectures. He had spent nearly an hour explaining the possibility of machine superintelligence to a fascinated audience. The crowd had loved it. Reporters had quoted it. Investors had discussed it afterward. Yet halfway home, Mara had turned toward him and asked a single question that he had largely forgotten until now. What happens if people start needing it to be true? At the time he had laughed. Now he wasn't laughing. Because for the first time, Nathan was beginning to suspect that millions of people did need it to be true. And if that was the case, then the technical debate he had spent his career participating in was about to become something far larger, far messier, and far more dangerous than a disagreement about artificial intelligence. It was becoming a conflict between reality and belief, and history suggested that reality did not always win quickly. Chapter 4. Nathan Hale had spent most of his professional life around scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and the occasional philosopher, which meant he was accustomed to people who could tolerate uncertainty for extended periods of time. Researchers often disagreed fiercely, but they generally accepted that reality did not care about their preferences. A hypothesis could survive or fail. A theory could strengthen or weaken. An experiment could produce results that nobody wanted. There was an implicit understanding that nature was under no obligation to cooperate with human expectations. Investors, Nathan had gradually learned, operated according to a different relationship with uncertainty. Their world was not built upon what was true in the present, but upon what might become true in the future. Entire fortunes depended on probabilities, projections, narratives, and confidence. A scientist could spend years proving something was impossible and receive a polite round of applause. An investor who correctly anticipated the next technological transformation could reshape industries, governments, and personal wealth on a scale that few scientists would ever experience. Because of that difference, investors developed an unusual sensitivity to stories. They were constantly searching for narratives capable of organizing the future. The meeting with Daniel Mercer took place in a private dining room overlooking the northern edge of the bay. The restaurant itself was discreet in the way only expensive establishments could be. There were no signs announcing exclusivity, no velvet ropes, no visible security. Everything about the place communicated that those who belonged would already know where to find it. Nathan arrived a few minutes early and was seated beside a window that framed the water in soft evening light. Cargo ships moved slowly in the distance, their silhouettes dark against a horizon turning gold beneath the setting sun. For a few moments he found himself distracted by the view, grateful for a scene that obeyed physical laws rather than market expectations. Daniel Mercer arrived precisely on time. Nathan recognized him immediately, though not because of magazine covers or television appearances. Mercer possessed the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to occupying rooms without asking permission. He was in his early 60s, tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a man who had spent decades making decisions involving sums of money large enough to alter national economies. Yet what struck Nathan most was how ordinary he appeared. There was no theatrical charisma, no exaggerated energy. If anything, Mercer resembled a university professor more than one of the most influential investors in the world. After brief introductions and a few minutes of polite conversation about travel and conference schedules, The discussion arrived at its actual destination with remarkable efficiency. "I'll save us both some time," Mercer said as the waiter departed. "You're writing something." Nathan studied him for a moment before nodding. There seemed little value in pretending otherwise. "That's a broad statement." "It's a specific statement." Nathan smiled faintly. Mercer returned the smile. "The advantage of being old is that people underestimate how much information still travels through human beings." "I've noticed." "I'm sure you have." For a few moments, neither man spoke. Outside the window, a tugboat moved slowly across the bay, guiding a larger vessel toward open water. Nathan found himself watching it with unexpected interest. Finally, Mercer leaned forward slightly. "I'd like to ask you a question, Nathan. Not as an investor. Not as someone with money at stake. Just as a person trying to understand what you think is happening." Nathan appreciated the phrasing because it was obviously untrue. Everything Mercer did involved money at stake. The difference was that he was honest enough to acknowledge the distinction while simultaneously ignoring it. "What would you like to know?" Mercer folded his hands together. "Do you believe artificial general intelligence is impossible?" The question was so direct that Nathan almost laughed. "No." Mercer's eyebrows rose slightly. "No." "No." The investor leaned back. "That's not what I expected." "Most people are misunderstanding my concerns." Mercer gestured for him to continue. Nathan took a moment to organize his thoughts. The distinction mattered. "I don't think intelligence is impossible to reproduce," he said. "I don't think machine cognition is inherently unattainable. What concerns me is the assumption that current approaches inevitably lead there. Those are two very different claims." Mercer remained silent. Nathan continued. "The public conversation increasingly treats present-day AI systems as primitive versions of future minds. The assumption is that they're children who will eventually become adults if we continue scaling them. But what if that's the wrong analogy? What if there's something else entirely? Something extraordinarily useful but fundamentally different?" The investor nodded slowly. "You're suggesting we've mistaken a tool for a prototype?" "Possibly." The word hung between them. Possibly. Nathan had become increasingly careful with certainty. One of the privileges of age was discovering how dangerous certainty could become. The waiter arrived with drinks. The interruption provided both men an opportunity to think. When they were alone again, Mercer surprised him. "Have you ever studied railway bubbles?" Nathan blinked. "Railway bubbles?" "England, 19th century." Nathan nodded cautiously. "A little." Mercer smiled. "The railways changed everything. They transformed transportation, commerce, communication, and economic development. They were among the most important technologies ever developed." The investors were correct about the technology. He paused. They were catastrophically wrong about the valuations. Nathan felt an uncomfortable recognition forming. Mercer continued. "The same thing happened with radio, automobiles, aviation, the internet. In every case, the underlying technology transformed society. The mistake was assuming that transformation justified every prediction attached to it." The waiter delivered dinner. Neither man touched it immediately. Mercer looked out toward the water. "People misunderstand bubbles. They think bubbles require fraud. They don't. Most bubbles form around something real." Nathan nodded. That matched his own thinking exactly. "The internet changed the world," Mercer continued. "But that didn't mean every internet company deserved infinite valuation. Housing matters. That didn't justify every housing price. Railroads mattered. That didn't justify every railroad stock." He turned back toward Nathan. "So let me ask the question differently." Nathan waited. Mercer's gaze remained steady. "What if the singularity is the valuation?" The sentence landed with surprising force. Nathan felt himself sit slightly straighter. Because that was it. That was exactly it. Not the technology, the expectation, the promise. the imagined future. For years, people had treated the singularity as a technological prediction. Increasingly, Nathan suspected it functioned more like a financial assumption. Trillions of dollars had been invested not merely in AI's current capabilities, but in the expectation of future capabilities. Companies were valued according to what they might someday become. Governments planned according to what machines might someday achieve. Entire labor markets were reorganizing around expectations rather than realities. The realization felt simultaneously obvious and profound. Mercer seemed to notice the change in Nathan's expression. "Interesting." Nathan smiled faintly. "What is?" "You hadn't thought about it exactly that way." "No. But you agree." Nathan looked back toward the bay. "I think there's truth in it." Mercer nodded. "That's what worries me." For the next hour, their conversation ranged across economics, history, technology, and human psychology. Nathan found himself enjoying it despite his initial reluctance. Mercer possessed the rare ability to discuss enormous systems without reducing them to slogans. He understood incentives. He understood narratives. Most importantly, he understood that societies often became trapped inside stories they desperately wanted to believe. At one point, the conversation shifted toward employment. "Have you noticed something strange?" Mercer asked. Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Probably." The investor laughed. "Fair." He took a sip of water. For years, people have predicted mass unemployment from AI. Entire policy frameworks are being developed around the assumption. Yet unemployment remains remarkably resilient. Nathan nodded. The observation wasn't new. Predictions of imminent labor collapse had repeatedly failed to materialize. Automation certainly displaced specific jobs. It always had. But economies adapted. New work emerged. Existing work changed. Reality proved more complicated than the forecasts. Mercer leaned forward. "Do you know why I think that is?" Nathan waited. "Because human labor isn't merely task completion." The sentence reminded Nathan of something Mara might have said. Mercer continued. "Most analyses treat work as a collection of discrete activities. Answer emails, analyze spreadsheets, write reports, review contracts, generate designs. But that's not how organizations actually function." Nathan felt an unexpected surge of interest. The investor was touching something important. Something many technologists overlooked. "Go on?" Mercer smiled. "I've spent 40 years investing in companies. Do you know what most executives actually do?" Nathan shook his head. "They absorb uncertainty." The answer surprised him. Mercer continued. "They make incomplete decisions with insufficient information. They manage conflicting incentives. They build trust. They evaluate credibility. They navigate ambiguity. They notice when something feels wrong before they can explain why." Nathan thought about that. The description felt accurate. More accurate than many formal definitions of management. Most organizations, Mercer said, run on judgment, not information. Outside the window, darkness had fully settled across the bay. The city lights reflected off the water. For a moment, neither man spoke. Nathan found himself thinking about the countless demonstrations he had witnessed over the past decade. Every benchmark, every capability test, every astonishing example of machine competence. Almost all of them shared one thing in common. The problem was already known. The objective was already defined. Success could be measured. The task existed inside boundaries. Human life rarely worked that way. Real decisions often involved determining what the problem actually was, or whether there was a problem at all, or which problem deserved attention first. Machines excelled within frames. Humans excelled at choosing frames. The distinction suddenly felt significant, perhaps even fundamental. Mercer eventually checked his watch. "I should let you get home." Nathan nodded. They stood. Neither man seemed eager to summarize the conversation. Some discussions resisted neat conclusions. As they walked toward the exit, Mercer paused. "One last question." Nathan waited. The investor's expression became unusually serious. If your concerns are correct, what happens next? Nathan considered the question carefully. Outside, a cool wind moved across the water. The city hummed quietly beyond the parking lot. For a long moment, he watched the lights stretching across the bay. Then he answered honestly, "I don't know." Mercer nodded. "Good." Nathan looked at him. The investor smiled faintly. "That's the first answer tonight that makes me optimistic." They shook hands. Then Daniel Mercer disappeared into the darkness. Nathan stood alone beside the water for several minutes after the meeting ended. The conversation lingered in his thoughts during the drive home and continued lingering long after he arrived. By midnight, he was back in his study, surrounded by reports, charts, and the growing manuscript that now occupied more than 100 pages. Yet something had changed. Until now, he had focused primarily on the technical evidence, the plateau, the evaluation results, the limitations of current architectures, the widening gap between public expectations and private observations. Tonight he found himself thinking about something larger: belief. Not belief in machines, belief in the future, because perhaps the true power of the singularity narrative had never been technological at all. Perhaps its real power came from the promise it offered: a future where intelligence became abundant, a future where difficult problems became solvable, a future where uncertainty itself might finally be conquered. Humans had always longed for such promises. The forms changed. The longing remained. As Nathan stared at the blinking cursor on his screen, he began to suspect that the greatest challenge ahead would not be convincing people that machine intelligence had limits. The greatest challenge would be convincing them that limits might not be a tragedy. Because if humanity had spent the past decade preparing to hand responsibility over to something greater than itself, then the possibility that no such successor was coming might prove far more unsettling than anyone yet understood. Chapter 5. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday morning, though almost nobody recognized it as such. For most people, it looked like an ordinary earnings call. A large technology company reported quarterly results. Executives discussed growth initiatives. Analysts asked questions. Journalists extracted headlines. Investors updated spreadsheets. Markets moved a few percentage points in one direction or another before turning their attention to the next event. The entire process repeated thousands of times every year. Yet as Nathan Hale sat in his study listening to the call through a pair of aging headphones, he felt the familiar sensation that something important was happening beneath the surface. It reminded him of his early years as a researcher, when a seemingly insignificant anomaly would appear in an experiment. Most anomalies turned out to be measurement errors. Occasionally, they revealed something much larger. The chief executive on the call sounded enthusiastic. Revenue growth remained strong. Customer adoption continued accelerating. Demand for AI services exceeded expectations. The prepared remarks contained all the phrases investors had come to expect: transformational opportunity, long-term growth trajectory, historic technological shift, unprecedented demand. Nothing unusual there. The interesting part arrived during the questions. An analyst from a major investment bank asked about infrastructure costs. The answer lasted less than 2 minutes. Nathan replayed it 3 times. Not because of what the executive said, because of what he avoided saying. The company had spent nearly $30 billion expanding computational infrastructure over the previous 18 months. Everyone knew that. The numbers were public. What the executive did not clearly explain was why those costs continued growing faster than capability improvements. Instead, the response drifted toward customer demand, future opportunities, and strategic positioning. The answer sounded convincing. It simply didn't answer the question. Nathan opened a spreadsheet and entered the latest figures beside data he had been collecting for months. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Across the industry, the economics were growing increasingly strange. Compute expenditures were rising dramatically. Training costs were rising dramatically. Energy consumption was rising dramatically. Yet capability improvements, while still real, appeared increasingly incremental. 10 years earlier, A tenfold increase in computational resources might have produced astonishing leaps in performance. Now similar expenditures often generated improvements that required benchmark specialists to explain. That did not mean progress had stopped. Far from it. The systems remained useful, sometimes remarkably useful. But the relationship between investment and improvement appeared to be changing. The curve was bending. The industry simply didn't want to discuss it. Nathan stared at the growing spreadsheet. Numbers had always possessed a certain honesty that public narratives lacked. A graph did not care whether it supported an executive's compensation package. A cost curve felt no loyalty toward shareholders. Mathematical relationships remained stubbornly indifferent to public enthusiasm. Perhaps that was why he found himself trusting numbers more as he grew older. People became invested in stories. Numbers merely described consequences. By noon, his inbox contained 3 additional messages from researchers at other companies. The communications arrived through encrypted channels and avoided unnecessary details, but the pattern remained familiar. Internal evaluations continued showing diminishing returns. New model releases required dramatically larger budgets for increasingly modest gains. Some teams had quietly begun shifting resources away from scaling and toward optimization, workflow integration, and domain-specific applications, because those areas produced measurable value, while fundamental capability gains became harder to obtain. The messages were not dramatic. No one claimed the industry was collapsing. No one suggested AI was a failure. In some ways, the opposite was true. The technology had become so useful that practical deployment now mattered more than speculative breakthroughs. Yet public discussion remained fixated on the next leap, the next revolution, the next emergence, the next moment when machines would supposedly cross some invisible threshold and become something fundamentally different. Nathan found himself wondering whether expectations often peaked just as reality began asserting itself. History offered numerous examples. The railway boom had survived. Railways transformed civilization. The automobile industry survived. Cars transformed civilization. The Internet survived. The Internet transformed civilization. What failed were the fantasies attached to them. Investors often assumed that technological importance and financial valuation were the same thing. They weren't. A technology could change the world and still disappoint those who expected miracles. That afternoon, Nathan drove across the bay to meet an old friend named Victor Lang. Victor had spent most of his career analyzing technology markets and possessed an unusual talent for identifying trends before they became obvious. Unlike many analysts, he cared less about stock prices than underlying structures. He treated industries the way geologists treated fault lines. The restaurant they chose overlooked the marina. Sailboats rocked gently against their moorings while seabirds drifted across a bright blue sky. It was the kind of afternoon that encouraged people to imagine the world was simpler than it really was. Victor arrived carrying a tablet and a worn leather notebook. "You're becoming difficult to find," he said as he sat down. Nathan smiled. "I wasn't aware I was hiding." "You're not hiding. You're thinking." Victor signaled for coffee. "In my experience, that's usually more dangerous." They spent the first half hour discussing ordinary matters. Families, aging, former colleagues. The peculiar realization that many of the industry's younger stars had been children when Nathan published some of his most influential papers. Eventually, Victor leaned back. "All right," Nathan laughed. "All right, what?" "You didn't ask me to meet because you wanted to discuss retirement planning." "Fair enough." Nathan reached into his briefcase and removed several charts. Victor examined them quietly. Minutes passed. The marina sparkled outside. Coffee cooled. Neither man spoke. Finally, Victor set the papers down. "Interesting." Nathan waited. "You're looking at capital efficiency?" "Among other things." Victor nodded. "That's the right place to look." Nathan had suspected as much. Most public discussions focused on capability benchmarks, how well models performed, which tasks they could complete, what new abilities had appeared. Far fewer people examined economics, yet economics ultimately determined sustainability. A capability that required $1 might spread across the world. A capability requiring $1 million per use would remain niche regardless of its sophistication. Victor studied the charts again. The public conversation still assumes capability growth and economic viability are moving together. They aren't? Victor smiled faintly. They rarely do. He tapped one graph. This is the interesting part. Nathan leaned forward. The cost per unit of meaningful improvement is exploding. The statement sounded almost absurdly simple, yet it captured the heart of the issue. Early gains had been relatively inexpensive. Later gains required enormous resources. Each new advance demanded larger investments, larger training clusters, larger energy budgets, larger engineering teams, larger infrastructure commitments. The gains continued. But they arrived more reluctantly, like water squeezed from increasingly dry stone. Victor took another sip of coffee. Markets can tolerate expensive growth for a long time. Nathan nodded. But eventually someone asks whether the growth justifies the expense. The words lingered between them, because that question sat at the center of everything. Not whether AI worked, it clearly worked. Not whether it mattered. It clearly mattered. The question was whether current approaches actually led toward the future everyone expected, or whether the industry had mistaken a powerful tool for the beginning of something much larger. When Nathan returned home that evening, he found himself thinking less about technology and more about human behavior. For decades, he had assumed that intelligence represented the central mystery of artificial intelligence. Increasingly, he suspected the real mystery involved belief. Why were people so eager for the singularity? The question seemed obvious at first: power, productivity, scientific progress, economic growth. Yet the longer he considered it, the more incomplete those explanations felt. The attraction appeared deeper than that. The singularity offered a form of relief. If a superior intelligence was coming, perhaps humanity would no longer be responsible for solving its own problems. Perhaps climate change, disease, poverty, political conflict, resource management, and countless other challenges would eventually be handed over to something wiser. The promise wasn't merely technological. It was psychological. The narrative suggested that history itself might be approaching a handoff, a moment when human limitations ceased being the primary constraint. As twilight settled across the bay, Nathan sat alone in his study and reread sections of his manuscript. The document had grown beyond 150 pages. What had begun as a technical review was gradually becoming something else. The evidence still mattered. The charts still mattered. The evaluations still mattered. Yet increasingly they felt like pieces of a larger story. The story of a civilization that had become captivated by its own expectations. Outside the window, lights appeared one by one across the water. Ferries moved through the darkness. Airplanes crossed the sky like distant stars. Somewhere in the city, engineers continued training larger models. Investors continued funding larger projects. Governments continued drafting larger plans. The momentum remained enormous, perhaps unstoppable, and yet Nathan could not shake the feeling that beneath all the excitement, beneath all the headlines and valuations and predictions, a simpler reality was quietly asserting itself. Not every curve continued forever. Not every trend became destiny. Not every powerful technology evolved into a god. For the first time in months, he opened a fresh section of the manuscript and gave it a new title: The Hidden Numbers. Then, he began writing about something almost nobody wanted to discuss. Not what the machines could do, but what it cost to make them do it. Because he was beginning to suspect that the future of artificial intelligence might ultimately be determined not by breakthroughs in cognition, but by a far older force that had humbled countless technological dreams before it. Economics. Chapter 6. Nathan Hale did not sleep much during the weeks that followed. The manuscript continued growing at a pace that surprised him, not because writing had become easier, but because new evidence seemed to arrive almost daily. What had begun as a personal investigation now felt increasingly like a convergence. Researchers from different companies, countries, and specialties continued reaching out through quiet channels, sharing observations that were often remarkably similar despite being generated independently. The specifics varied. Different organizations measured different things. Different evaluation teams focused on different capabilities. Yet the broader pattern remained stubbornly consistent. Modern AI systems were becoming more useful, more polished, more integrated, and more capable of assisting humans across a growing range of tasks. At the same time, many of the deeper limitations surrounding reasoning, autonomy, judgment, and genuine understanding appeared far more resistant to improvement than public narratives suggested. Nathan had expected disagreement. Instead, he was finding echoes. One evening, after nearly 10 hours of reviewing reports, he pushed himself away from his desk and walked outside. The sun had already disappeared behind the hills, leaving the bay painted in shades of blue and silver. A cool wind moved through the trees surrounding the house. Across the water, the lights of the city shimmered against the darkness, giving the impression of a civilization floating between certainty and reflection. Nathan often found that difficult questions became easier to examine when he was moving rather than sitting. Throughout his career, some of his best ideas had emerged while walking. Perhaps human cognition had evolved for landscapes rather than offices. As he followed a trail overlooking the shoreline, his thoughts drifted toward a question that had increasingly occupied him during recent months. If the singularity narrative was wrong, what exactly had people misunderstood? Most critics focused on technology itself. They argued that AI could not think, could not reason, could not create. Nathan considered those arguments simplistic. The machines clearly could do many of those things, at least to varying degrees. The real misunderstanding seemed subtler. Society had become fixated on measuring what machines were gaining while paying surprisingly little attention to what humans already possessed. That realization had emerged gradually. At first, Nathan had viewed intelligence as something that could be decomposed into individual capabilities: language, logic, planning, memory, learning, pattern recognition. Those assumptions had guided much of modern AI research. If intelligence consisted of components, then perhaps machines could eventually acquire those components one by one until the complete structure emerged naturally. Yet decades of work had produced an uncomfortable possibility. What if intelligence was not simply the sum of its parts? What if something essential existed in the relationships between those parts? The idea reminded Nathan of early aviation research. Engineers had spent years attempting to build flying machines by studying individual features of birds: wings, feathers, muscle structures, aerodynamics. Eventually, they discovered that successful flight did not require copying birds at all. Airplanes achieved the same outcome through entirely different principles. Perhaps the opposite was occurring with artificial intelligence. Researchers had become so focused on replicating visible outputs of human cognition that they were overlooking deeper mechanisms responsible for producing those outputs in the first place. The thought remained with him long after he returned home. The next morning, he received an unexpected call from his daughter. Emily rarely phoned during school hours. The timing immediately caught his attention. "Everything okay?" he asked after answering. "Everything's fine," she said. "I just had a free period." Nathan smiled. Emily always sounded slightly amused by the fact that he worried. "You sound tired." "Probably because I am." "Still working on your secret project?" Nathan laughed softly. Apparently the project was no longer entirely secret. "Something like that." There was a brief pause. Then Emily asked a question that surprised him. "Can I tell you something strange?" "Of course." "I've been watching my students." Nathan waited. "That's generally considered part of teaching." She ignored the joke. "The last couple years they've become convinced they're competing against machines." Nathan felt a familiar heaviness settle into his chest. Emily continued. "They talk about it constantly, not just careers, everything. Writing, art, problem solving, research. Some of them genuinely believe there's no point developing certain skills because computers will eventually do everything better. Nathan remained silent. The observation was hardly new, yet hearing it from his daughter carried different weight. "They're 16 years old," Emily said. "They're making decisions about their lives based on assumptions that nobody seems able to verify." Outside his study window, morning sunlight reflected off the bay. Nathan found himself staring at the water. "What do you tell them?" Emily laughed. "The truth." "Which is?" "Nobody knows." Nathan smiled. "Good answer." "It's also apparently unpopular." The conversation drifted toward other topics after that, but Emily's comment lingered long after the call ended, perhaps because it highlighted something he had increasingly noticed throughout society. The singularity was no longer merely a technological prediction. It had become a psychological force. People adjusted behavior based on expectations of future intelligence. Students selected majors. Governments drafted policies. Investors allocated capital. Workers reconsidered careers. Entire populations were making decisions today because of assumptions about tomorrow. And what if those assumptions were wrong? The question felt more urgent than ever. That afternoon, Nathan returned to the manuscript and began drafting what would become its central chapter. Until now, much of the document had focused on limitations: plateauing returns, economic constraints, persistent reasoning failures, misaligned expectations, important subjects certainly, but fundamentally negative ones. They described what machines might not become. This chapter would focus on something different. It would examine what humans already were. As he wrote, Nathan found himself revisiting conversations accumulated across decades. Engineers navigating ambiguous crises, doctors recognizing subtle symptoms that violated established patterns, teachers sensing emotional struggles hidden beneath ordinary behavior, managers detecting organizational problems before metrics revealed them, scientists pursuing ideas that initially appeared irrational, parents making decisions without sufficient information, entrepreneurs identifying opportunities invisible to experts. None of those activities fit neatly into benchmarks. Most could not be measured effectively at all, yet they occurred everywhere. Human beings constantly operated under conditions of incomplete information, uncertain objectives, conflicting incentives, emotional complexity, and changing environments. More importantly, they did so without requiring someone else to define the problem first. That distinction increasingly felt fundamental. Modern AI systems excelled when goals were specified clearly, inputs defined, success criteria established, context available. Humans possessed a remarkable ability to determine what mattered before those conditions existed. They could notice. They could care. They could decide which questions deserved asking. Nathan paused. The cursor blinked patiently on the screen. A memory surfaced. Years earlier, Mara had been diagnosed with cancer following a series of tests that initially appeared normal. Nathan remembered one particular specialist who had insisted something was wrong despite incomplete evidence. The doctor could not immediately explain why. Certain patterns simply felt inconsistent. Additional examinations followed, more testing. Eventually, the diagnosis emerged. At the time, Nathan had viewed the event as an example of professional expertise. Now he wondered whether it represented something deeper. Not intuition exactly, not reasoning exactly, something occupying the space between them, a form of judgment built from experience, observation, context, emotion, memory, uncertainty, and countless other factors that resisted decomposition. Machines could imitate portions of that process. Humans lived inside it. The distinction mattered. Hours passed. The chapter grew. As evening settled across the bay, Nathan realized he was no longer writing primarily about artificial intelligence. He was writing about human intelligence, or perhaps human consciousness, or perhaps something even harder to define. Whatever the label, he found himself increasingly convinced that modern society had made a subtle conceptual error. People often spoke as though intelligence existed on a single scale. More intelligence, less intelligence, smarter, dumber, human, artificial. Reality appeared far messier. The abilities that allowed humans to build civilizations involved far more than raw cognitive performance. They involved values, motivation, purpose, meaning, curiosity, trust, identity, responsibility, imagination, fear, love. The deeper Nathan examined the issue, the more he suspected that humanity's greatest advantage might not be intelligence itself. It might be ownership. Human beings possessed their thoughts, their goals, their experiences, their lives. Every decision emerged from a continuous stream of existence stretching backward through memory and forward through expectation. Machines processed information, humans inhabited reality. The distinction sounded almost philosophical, yet Nathan increasingly believed it had practical consequences. Near midnight, he finally stopped writing and stepped outside once more. The night air felt cool against his skin. The bay lay quiet beneath a sky scattered with stars. Somewhere beyond the horizon, thousands of researchers continued building larger models. Governments continued funding ambitious programs. Investors continued searching for the next breakthrough. The future remained uncertain. Perhaps a new architecture would emerge. Perhaps genuine machine intelligence would eventually arrive. Nathan no longer claimed certainty on that question. What he questioned was inevitability, and what he increasingly rejected was the assumption that human beings represented merely a temporary stage between biological evolution and something superior. For years, the technology industry had spoken as though humanity stood on the verge of being replaced. Tonight, standing beneath the stars, Nathan found himself considering a different possibility. Perhaps the most extraordinary intelligence on Earth was not the one people were trying to build. Perhaps it was the one they had spent the last decade learning to underestimate. When he returned to his desk, he added a new title to the manuscript: The Human Advantage. For the first time since beginning the project, the title felt less like a working draft and more like a conclusion. Chapter 7. The manuscript crossed 200 pages sometime during the second week of October, though Nathan Hale only noticed because his word processor displayed the number automatically in a small corner of the screen. The actual length no longer surprised him. What surprised him was how the project had changed. When he began writing, he imagined producing a technical paper, a careful assessment of current AI capabilities, scaling limitations, economic constraints, and the increasingly visible gap between public expectations and private evidence. Instead, the document had evolved into something much larger. Every new chapter seemed to reveal another layer of the story. Technical realities led to economic realities. Economic realities led to political realities. Political realities led to psychological realities. The deeper Nathan dug, the less he believed the AI debate was fundamentally about technology at all. It was becoming a story about human beings, about belief, and about what happened when an entire civilization became emotionally invested in a future that had not yet arrived. That realization was precisely why he had not published. Many people would later assume that fear was the reason. Some would imagine legal concerns, corporate pressure, financial consequences, or reputational risk. Those factors existed certainly, but they were not what kept the manuscript locked inside encrypted drives and offline storage devices scattered between his home, a bank deposit box, and the office of an attorney who did not yet know what he was holding. The real reason was uncertainty, not scientific uncertainty. Nathan's confidence in the evidence continued growing. The uncertainty involved consequences. Once released, the manuscript would develop a life of its own. It would travel beyond his control. Politicians would use it. Investors would use it. Journalists would simplify it. Critics would distort it. Supporters would exaggerate it. The world had become remarkably efficient at turning nuanced arguments into tribal slogans, and Nathan suspected his work would be no exception. Some mornings he convinced himself that publication was a moral obligation. Other mornings he wondered whether silence represented the more responsible choice. The conflict followed him everywhere. It accompanied him on walks along the shoreline. It sat beside him during meals. It appeared in the quiet moments before sleep. It waited beside the coffee maker each morning like an unwelcome but persistent companion. On a Thursday afternoon, While reviewing another batch of evaluation reports, Nathan received a message from Priya Das. The note contained only 4 words. Turn on the news, nothing else, no explanation, no context. Nathan immediately felt a tightening sensation in his chest. Researchers learned to recognize certain forms of communication. Short messages often carried more urgency than long ones. He reached for the remote and switched on the television mounted on the far wall of his study. Every major financial network was broadcasting the same story. A leak. The word appeared in enormous letters beneath images of data centers, corporate headquarters, and AI company logos. Nathan moved closer. A reporter was speaking rapidly while scrolling through excerpts from what appeared to be internal documents obtained from an unnamed source inside a major AI laboratory. The documents described plateauing benchmark improvements, escalating training costs, persistent reasoning limitations, internal disagreements about future capability projections. Nathan felt his pulse accelerate. Not because the information was new, because it was public. For months he had been speaking privately with researchers who understood the situation. Now the wall separating internal discussion from public conversation had finally cracked. The reporter continued. Analysts were debating the significance of the leak. Company representatives insisted the documents had been taken out of context. Industry advocates argued that temporary slowdowns were common throughout technological history. Skeptics claimed the leak confirmed long-standing concerns regarding overhyped expectations. Nathan watched silently. The details themselves were almost irrelevant. What mattered was that the discussion had begun. For years, the dominant narrative surrounding artificial intelligence had enjoyed something close to monopoly status. Questions focused on timing rather than direction. Debate centered on how quickly machine intelligence would surpass human capabilities rather than whether current approaches actually led there. Even critics generally accepted the underlying assumption. They worried about superintelligence. They worried about automation. They worried about concentration of power. Yet most shared the belief that increasingly powerful machine cognition remained inevitable. Now, for the first time, uncertainty had entered the conversation. Nathan's phone began vibrating almost immediately. Messages arrived from researchers across multiple companies, some excited, some nervous, some openly frightened. One message simply read, "It started." Nathan wasn't sure whether the sender intended the phrase as celebration or warning. Perhaps both. Outside his window, the afternoon remained deceptively ordinary. Boats moved across the bay. Traffic flowed along distant highways. Sunlight reflected from office towers downtown. Nothing in the physical world suggested that anything had changed. Yet Nathan understood that narratives often shifted before institutions did. The first crack appeared in belief. Everything else followed later. Throughout the evening, the story spread. Financial commentators discussed valuation implications. Political analysts examined potential policy consequences. Technology journalists produced explainers attempting to summarize increasingly complicated technical questions for general audiences. Social media exploded into predictable camps. Some people declared the entire AI revolution fraudulent. Others dismissed the leak as irrelevant noise. Most appeared less interested in understanding the evidence than determining which existing worldview the evidence could support. Nathan found the reaction depressingly familiar. Human beings rarely processed information in isolation. Information entered existing narratives. Then it was reshaped accordingly. The leak itself revealed little that surprised industry insiders. The public reaction revealed everything. By midnight, Nathan had turned the television off and retreated to his study. The house felt unusually quiet. The manuscript remained open on his monitor, its unfinished chapters glowing softly in the darkness. For a long time, he simply stared at the screen. Then his phone rang. Leah Marcus. Nathan hesitated before answering. "Hello." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. When Leah finally spoke, she sounded exhausted. "Well?" Nathan leaned back in his chair. "Well?" A faint laugh escaped her. Not amusement. Fatigue. "I suppose this was inevitable." "Probably." Another pause. Nathan imagined her sitting in some conference room surrounded by lawyers, communications advisors, executives, and investors. Every major company in the industry was likely conducting emergency meetings. Not because the leak itself contained devastating information, but because public uncertainty represented a threat few institutions knew how to manage. Leah spoke again. "Did you do it?" The question surprised him. "No. I didn't think so." "Then why ask?" "Because I had to." Nathan nodded despite knowing she couldn't see him. That was fair. The leak closely resembled concerns he had been discussing privately for months. He might have suspected himself under similar circumstances. "How bad is it?" he asked. Leah exhaled. "The documents aren't catastrophic. But the timing is." Nathan understood immediately. Narratives possessed momentum. For years, optimism had enjoyed the advantage. Now skepticism had entered the arena. Not victory, not dominance, just presence. And presence was enough. Because once people began questioning inevitability, they started looking differently at everything. The same evidence produced different conclusions. The same announcements sounded different. The same promises required more scrutiny. The conversation itself changed. Leah sounded distant when she spoke again. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "For years everyone accused us of exaggerating." Nathan waited. "Now I'm not sure anyone remembers what we actually said." The statement lingered. Because there was truth in it. Public narratives often evolved beyond their creators. Many executives genuinely believed their own forecasts. Many researchers genuinely believed in eventual machine intelligence. Many investors genuinely believed they were funding a transformational future. The problem was not necessarily dishonesty. The problem was collective amplification. Thousands of optimistic assumptions reinforcing one another until uncertainty disappeared. Leah continued. "I still think you're wrong." Nathan smiled faintly. "I know. But I'm starting to think you're wrong for more interesting reasons than I originally assumed." The comment felt strangely complimentary. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." For several moments neither spoke. Then Leah asked a question that caught him completely off guard. "If you're right, what happens to all the people who built their identities around this?" Nathan looked toward the manuscript. The answer arrived immediately. "I don't know." And for perhaps the first time since this entire process began, that uncertainty frightened him. Because Leah wasn't asking about companies, or markets, or technology. She was asking about people. Students who had chosen careers based on assumptions about the future. Researchers who had devoted decades to particular theories. Entrepreneurs who had built entire businesses around anticipated breakthroughs, workers who feared replacement, governments planning for disruption, investors betting on transformation. An entire generation had grown up hearing that machine superintelligence was approaching. What happened if it wasn't? After the call ended, Nathan walked outside. The night air felt cool and still. Across the bay, the city lights stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere in those buildings, thousands of conversations were unfolding simultaneously. Journalists preparing stories, investors updating models, researchers exchanging messages, executives drafting statements. The leak would dominate headlines for days, perhaps weeks. Yet Nathan suspected its real impact would take longer to emerge. The documents themselves were not the story. The possibility they introduced was the story. The possibility that the future might be different than expected. As he stood beneath the stars, Nathan remembered something Daniel Mercer had said weeks earlier during their dinner overlooking the water. What if the singularity is the valuation? At the time, the observation had seemed insightful. Tonight it felt prophetic, because valuations could fall, narratives could change, expectations could collapse. But reality remained. The question was whether people would recognize it when it arrived. Back inside the house, Nathan returned to his desk and opened a new chapter in the manuscript. For a long time, he stared at the blank page. Then he typed a title, "The Leak." Beneath it, he added a single sentence. The first public challenge to a belief system rarely destroys the belief system. It merely reveals that belief exists. Then he began writing. Chapter 8. For nearly 3 weeks after the leak, Nathan Hale did nothing. At least that was how it appeared from the outside. He gave no interviews. He published no articles. He made no public statements. He declined invitations from journalists, ignored requests from podcast hosts, and quietly rejected multiple offers to appear on television panels discussing the future of artificial intelligence. To many observers, the silence seemed unusual. Within certain circles, Nathan's skepticism had become an open secret. Rumors circulated among researchers. Investors exchanged speculation. Technology reporters began mentioning his name in articles discussing the growing debate over AI progress. Yet despite increasing attention, he remained largely invisible. The truth was that Nathan was working harder than he had at any point since his early career. Every morning began before sunrise: coffee, notes, revisions, evidence reviews. Every afternoon brought new data, new conversations, new challenges. Every evening ended with another round of edits to the manuscript. The document had grown beyond 300 pages and now occupied multiple versions stored across different locations. It no longer resembled a technical paper. It no longer resembled a book. Increasingly, it felt like a historical record assembled before history itself had decided what it wanted to become. The leak had changed something important. Not because it had proven Nathan correct. It hadn't. Reasonable people could still interpret the evidence differently. What the leak had done was introduce doubt into a narrative that previously allowed very little room for it. And once doubt entered a system, strange things happened. Questions multiplied. Conversations expanded. People who had remained silent began speaking. Researchers who previously shared concerns only in private became more willing to express uncertainty publicly. Investors started asking different questions during earnings calls. Journalists began seeking out dissenting perspectives. University departments organized debates that would have been considered unnecessary a year earlier. The shift was subtle, but it was real. Nathan noticed it everywhere. One evening, he sat alone in his study reviewing financial reports from several major AI firms when an email arrived from an economist at Stanford whom he had not spoken with in nearly a decade. The message contained no greeting and no explanation. Attached was a paper examining long-term productivity gains associated with AI deployment across several industries. The findings were fascinating. Not because they were negative, because they were modest. The systems clearly improved productivity. In some environments, the improvements were substantial, yet the results looked nothing like the economic revolution often described in public discussions. Most gains resembled previous waves of automation. Useful, important, sometimes transformative within specific domains, but nowhere near the civilization-altering disruption implied by forecasts built around imminent superintelligence. Nathan leaned back in his chair after finishing the report. The pattern was becoming familiar. Again and again, reality appeared more complicated than either side wanted. AI enthusiasts often exaggerated. AI critics often underestimated. The truth occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. The technology mattered enormously. It simply wasn't magic. As darkness settled beyond the windows, Nathan found himself thinking about an observation Daniel Mercer had made weeks earlier. Technologies rarely failed because they were useless. They failed because expectations became disconnected from reality. Railroads had transformed civilization. So had automobiles. So had electricity. So had the internet. Yet each technological revolution produced periods during which public imagination raced far ahead of practical implementation. Perhaps artificial intelligence was experiencing something similar. The possibility no longer felt controversial. It felt probable. The phone rang. Nathan glanced at the screen. Emily. His daughter sounded unusually serious. Dad, what's wrong? Nothing. The answer came too quickly. Nathan waited. After a few seconds, she laughed softly. I hate that you can tell. You always pause when nothing is wrong. That's annoying. It comes with being a parent. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said something unexpected. I think you should publish. Nathan stared at the dark window beside his desk. For several seconds he said nothing. Emily knew about the manuscript, not the details, but enough to understand what he was working on. "What makes you say that?" "I've been watching people." Nathan smiled faintly. That sounded remarkably similar to something he might have said. "Go on." "The students are anxious." "About AI?" "About everything." Her voice softened. "They think the future is already decided." Nathan looked toward the manuscript lying open beside him. 300 pages, months of work, countless conversations, an enormous amount of uncertainty. Emily continued, "I don't know if you're right." "Neither do I." "I know." A pause followed. "But I think people deserve to hear another possibility." The sentence lingered after the conversation ended. People deserve to hear another possibility. Not certainty, not prediction, possibility. Nathan walked outside shortly afterward. The night air carried the faint smell of salt water drifting in from the bay. Across the shoreline, lights shimmered against the darkness. Ferries moved slowly between distant terminals. Aircraft crossed overhead in steady silence. For years, discussions about artificial intelligence had revolved around a remarkably narrow range of futures. Superintelligence, automation, human irrelevance, economic disruption, machine dominance. The details varied, but the direction remained largely consistent. The future was always something happening to humanity. Rarely something humanity continued shaping. Perhaps that was part of the appeal. Responsibility became easier when transferred elsewhere. A superior intelligence would arrive. The difficult decisions would be solved. The uncertainty would end. The burden would shift. Nathan increasingly suspected that many people found comfort in that narrative. The alternative was far messier. The alternative suggested that human beings remained responsible for themselves, for their institutions, for their economies, for their mistakes, for their future. As he stood looking out across the water, Nathan realized something that had been slowly forming beneath the surface of his thinking for months. The manuscript was no longer primarily about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence was simply the vehicle. The real subject was human agency. The entire debate ultimately revolved around a single question: what if no successor was coming? The thought felt strangely liberating and terrifying. Because if there would be no imminent superintelligence arriving to solve humanity's problems, then humanity remained accountable for solving them itself. Climate change, political instability, economic inequality, education, healthcare, scientific progress, social cohesion. The list stretched endlessly. No machine would rescue civilization from the consequences of its own decisions. Civilization would have to continue doing what it had always done: struggle forward imperfectly. The next morning, Nathan made a decision. It arrived quietly, without drama, without revelation, without certainty. He sat at his desk shortly after dawn, opened the latest version of the manuscript, and stared at the title page. The Human Advantage. The words looked different now, not because the title had changed, because he finally understood what it meant. For months he had interpreted the phrase as an argument about intelligence: human intelligence versus machine intelligence, human reasoning versus machine reasoning, human judgment versus machine judgment. But that wasn't quite right. The real advantage was responsibility. Human beings cared about outcomes because they lived inside those outcomes. They suffered consequences. They formed relationships. They built communities. They inherited history. They created meaning. Machines processed information. Humans inhabited existence. The distinction seemed obvious. Yet somehow society had become increasingly willing to forget it. Nathan opened a new email. The recipient was a publisher he trusted, an old acquaintance who had spent decades navigating complicated scientific controversies. He attached the manuscript. Then he stared at the screen. His finger hovered above the keyboard. For a brief moment he considered closing the laptop. Waiting longer, collecting more evidence, adding another chapter, refining another section. Researchers often delayed publication because uncertainty never completely disappeared. There was always another study, another experiment, another data point, another reason to wait. But eventually waiting became its own decision. Nathan thought about Mara, about Emily, about Priya, about the countless students building their futures around assumptions that might prove wrong, about the researchers privately expressing doubts they felt unable to discuss publicly, about the investors, executives, and policymakers making decisions that affected millions of lives. Then he pressed send. The email disappeared. Nothing changed. The room remained quiet. The bay remained visible beyond the window. The coffee remained warm beside his keyboard. The world did not shake. No alarms sounded. No headlines appeared. For several seconds, Nathan felt almost foolish. Months of hesitation reduced to a single keystroke. Then he understood something important. The real consequence wasn't sending the manuscript. The real consequence was that he no longer controlled it. The argument now belonged to the world. Outside, morning sunlight spread slowly across the water. Nathan watched it for a long time. For the first time in months, he felt neither certain nor uncertain, neither optimistic nor pessimistic, only relieved. Whatever happened next would happen in public. And after spending nearly a year studying belief systems, narratives, expectations, and the future of intelligence, Nathan found himself returning to a surprisingly simple conclusion. Truth was rarely powerful because it was perfect. Truth was powerful because eventually it had to compete with reality. And reality, unlike stories, never stopped keeping score. Chapter 9. The first reviews appeared less than 48 hours after publication, and they arrived with a speed that would have impressed Nathan Hale if he had not spent most of his adult life observing how rapidly modern institutions could mobilize when confronted with an unwelcome idea. The Human Advantage had not yet become a bestseller. It had not even been publicly available long enough for most people to read it. That detail turned out to be largely irrelevant. In the age of instantaneous commentary, reactions often arrived long before comprehension. By the end of the second day, articles, opinion pieces, podcasts, video essays, social media threads, investment newsletters, political commentaries, and corporate statements had begun forming around the manuscript like weather systems developing around a newly discovered island. Nathan watched much of it unfold from his study overlooking the bay. Though watching was perhaps the wrong word. Enduring felt more accurate. The manuscript's publication had triggered exactly the response he had feared, and exactly the response he had expected. Some commentators described the book as a courageous correction to an overheated narrative. Others dismissed it as the bitter reflections of an aging scientist unable to accept that younger generations had surpassed him. Several articles spent more time discussing Nathan himself than the evidence presented in the manuscript. His age, career, previous predictions, speaking engagements, professional relationships, investment holdings, personal history, and even photographs from old conferences became subjects of analysis. One particularly hostile article argued that the Human Advantage represented little more than an elaborate attempt to preserve human exceptionalism in the face of inevitable technological progress. Another claimed Nathan was secretly funded by industries threatened by automation. A third suggested he had become intellectually isolated after the death of his wife and was projecting personal grief onto technological forecasts. Nathan found that last accusation especially interesting. Not because it was true, because it revealed something important about public discourse. The article devoted nearly 2,000 words to analyzing Nathan's psychology and fewer than 200 words to discussing the evidence. Reality had become secondary. Narrative came first. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes felt lower. 3 days after publication, Nathan received a call from Daniel Mercer. The investor sounded almost cheerful. "I assume you've stopped reading the commentary?" "I lasted 6 hours." "Better than most." Nathan laughed softly. Outside his window, morning fog drifted across the water. The city skyline appeared and disappeared behind shifting layers of gray. "What do you think?" Nathan asked. Mercer was quiet for a moment. I think the reaction tells us more than the book. Nathan considered that. Explain. The people attacking you aren't actually attacking your conclusions. No. They're defending assumptions. The observation lingered, because it felt accurate. Over the previous several days, Nathan had noticed something similar. Very few critics challenged the underlying data directly. The reports, evaluations, cost curves, scaling limitations, and economic analyses remained largely uncontested. Instead, most criticism focused on interpretation. What did the data mean? What future did it imply? What conclusions should society draw? The disagreement increasingly resembled a conflict between competing worldviews. Mercer continued. For 20 years, civilization has been investing emotionally, financially, and politically in a particular future. Nathan looked toward the fog-covered bay. And now? Now you've suggested that future might not exist. The simplicity of the statement made it difficult to argue with, because the human advantage never claimed artificial intelligence was useless. It never argued that machine cognition was impossible. It never predicted the collapse of the industry. The manuscript made a narrower and far more controversial claim, namely that the evidence supporting imminent superintelligence had become significantly weaker than public narratives suggested, and that humanity might be overestimating how quickly current technologies could evolve into genuinely autonomous minds. The distinction seemed obvious to Nathan. It appeared far less obvious to everyone else. After ending the call, he spent several hours reviewing messages from researchers around the world. The volume had become overwhelming. Some correspondence contained additional evidence supporting his conclusions. Some offered alternative interpretations. Many simply expressed relief that someone had finally articulated concerns they had privately held for years. One message in particular remained with him. The sender was a young researcher in Germany whom Nathan had never met. The note contained only a few sentences. I don't know whether you're right, but for the first time in years, it feels permissible to ask the question. Nathan read the message 3 times. Then he printed it and pinned it beside his desk. Because ultimately that had always been the point. Not certainty, permission. Permission to question assumptions. Permission to examine evidence. Permission to admit uncertainty. Science had once depended upon such permissions. Increasingly, public discourse did not. As the weeks passed, the debate intensified. Television panels discussed the manuscript nightly. Investment firms published lengthy analyses. Government agencies quietly commissioned internal reviews. University departments organized conferences examining the implications. Every major technology publication seemed determined to either celebrate or condemn the book. What surprised Nathan most was how little attention anyone paid to the central argument. The public conversation continuously drifted toward extremes. Either AI was about to become superintelligent, or AI was useless. Either the future remained unchanged, or civilization had been deceived. Nuance struggled to survive. Reality rarely offered satisfying headlines. One afternoon, while preparing notes for an upcoming interview, Nathan received an unexpected visitor. Leah Marcus. The request arrived through a mutual acquaintance. Private meeting, no media, no staff, no recordings. Nathan almost declined. Then curiosity prevailed. They met at a small restaurant overlooking the Pacific coast several days later. The location sat far enough from San Francisco to discourage accidental encounters, and close enough for a quiet afternoon drive. Ocean waves rolled steadily against rocky cliffs while seabirds drifted above the shoreline. The setting possessed the sort of timeless beauty that made technological controversies feel strangely temporary. Leah arrived wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, which only made her more recognizable. Nathan smiled when he saw her. You've become bad at disguises. She removed the glasses. I've become recognizable. That too. For a while they talked about nothing important. Food, travel, mutual acquaintances, aging. The odd experience of watching younger generations rediscover ideas that had once seemed revolutionary. Eventually the conversation reached its inevitable destination. You've caused quite a mess." Nathan nodded. "So I've been told." Leah studied him carefully. "You look calmer than I expected." Nathan glanced toward the ocean. "I spent months imagining the worst possible outcome. And, so far, reality remains less creative." That earned a genuine laugh. For a moment they resembled old colleagues again, rather than participants in one of the industry's most public disagreements. Then Leah grew serious. "I still think you're underestimating long-term potential." "I might be." The answer surprised her. Nathan could tell. "You might be?" "Of course." Leah leaned back. "You've spent 300 pages arguing otherwise." "No." Nathan shook his head. "I spent 300 pages arguing against certainty." The distinction mattered, perhaps more than anything else. For years, technological forecasting had become increasingly confident. Timelines shortened, predictions sharpened, expectations solidified, possibilities transformed into assumptions. The human advantage challenged that confidence. Nothing more, nothing less. Leah remained quiet. Finally, she nodded. "I think that's the part people keep missing." Nathan smiled. "Which part?" "You're not saying machine intelligence won't happen." "No." "You're saying we don't know." "Exactly." The ocean crashed against the cliffs below. Wind moved through nearby trees. For several moments neither spoke. Then Leah surprised him. "You know what frightens me?" Nathan waited. "Not that you're wrong." The answer caught him off guard. "Then what?" Leah stared toward the horizon. "That you're right about the psychology." Nathan said nothing. She continued. "For years I've watched investors, governments, employees, journalists, and executives build expectations around increasingly powerful AI. Some of those expectations are reasonable, some aren't. But they've all become tangled together." Nathan understood. The technology and the mythology had merged. Separating them would not be easy. Leah looked back at him. If the mythology breaks before the technology matures, things could get ugly. The statement lingered between them, because both understood what she meant. Markets could overreact. Public trust could collapse. Funding could disappear. Promising research could become collateral damage. History contained numerous examples of technologies suffering because expectations had raced too far ahead of practical reality. Nathan nodded slowly. "That's possible." Leah smiled faintly. "You always did have a talent for understatement." As the afternoon sunlight faded toward evening, their conversation gradually shifted away from AI. They discussed families, old colleagues, retirement plans neither truly intended to follow, and the peculiar realization that both of them now occupied the elder generation within an industry that increasingly celebrated youth. When they finally stood to leave, neither mentioned the manuscript again. Some arguments reached a point where repetition added little. Outside, the Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Nathan watched Leah walk toward her car before turning toward his own. For a moment he stood alone beside the ocean. The backlash continued growing. The debate continued expanding. The uncertainty continued spreading. Yet standing there, listening to waves that had been arriving on those shores long before computers existed, Nathan found himself feeling strangely hopeful. Not because people agreed with him. Most didn't. Not because the controversy was ending. It wasn't, but because the conversation had changed. For the first time in years, society seemed willing to entertain a possibility it had largely ignored. The possibility that intelligence might be more complicated than expected. The possibility that human beings remained more important than assumed. The possibility that the future was not inevitable, only uncertain. And uncertainty, Nathan reflected as he watched the sun disappear into the Pacific, was not a weakness of science. It was the beginning of it. Chapter 10. The first signs were so subtle that most people missed them. There was no dramatic collapse of the AI industry, no market crash powerful enough to dominate history books, No moment when executives marched onto stages and confessed that the future had been misunderstood. Reality, Nathan Hale discovered, was far too complicated for that. Technologies rarely failed in clean, theatrical ways. More often, they simply settled into their proper place. Artificial intelligence continued improving. Companies continued investing. Researchers continued publishing papers. Governments continued funding projects. The machines continued becoming more useful. And yet, over the 18 months following publication of The Human Advantage, something important changed. The conversation matured. The word inevitable appeared less frequently. Predictions became more cautious. Timelines grew longer, claims softened, questions multiplied. The future remained uncertain. For Nathan, that uncertainty felt less like a defeat and more like a return to intellectual honesty. One cold February morning, nearly 2 years after he had first begun writing the manuscript, he sat in a crowded auditorium at Stanford, listening to a panel discussion on artificial intelligence and economic productivity. The room contained researchers, students, investors, executives, policymakers, journalists, and academics. 20 years earlier, such a gathering would have focused almost entirely on capability forecasts. 10 years earlier, the discussion would have revolved around AGI timelines. 5 years earlier, nearly every participant would have been debating the arrival of superintelligence. Now the questions sounded different. How should AI be integrated into existing professions? Which applications generated genuine value? How could organizations measure productivity improvements realistically? Where did human judgment remain essential? What new forms of work might emerge? The change was subtle, yet Nathan noticed it immediately. The conversation had shifted from prophecy to implementation, from mythology to management, from speculation to reality. The technology had not disappeared. The religion surrounding it had weakened. That distinction mattered. After the panel ended, several students approached him. These encounters had become increasingly common. Some thanked him for writing the book. Others disagreed with its conclusions. Most wanted to discuss uncertainty. One young woman lingered after the others left. She introduced herself as a doctoral student studying machine learning. "I have a question." Nathan smiled. "That's usually a good sign." She laughed nervously. "When I started university, everyone told me AGI would arrive before I graduated." Nathan nodded. He had heard similar stories countless times. "It hasn't." "No." The student looked down briefly before continuing. "Do you think that's disappointing?" The question caught him off guard, not because it was difficult, because it was honest. For several seconds he considered the answer. Finally, he looked around the campus. Students crossed pathways carrying books, laptops, coffees, backpacks, and the countless worries associated with being young. Construction crews worked on new buildings. Professors hurried toward meetings. Conversations unfolded beneath trees planted long before anyone imagined artificial intelligence. Life continued. Human life, messy, complicated, unfinished. "No," Nathan said. The student seemed surprised. "No." "No," he smiled. "I think reality turned out to be more interesting." She thought about that. Then she smiled too. Before leaving, she asked one final question. "What happens next?" Nathan watched her disappear into the crowd before answering, though perhaps he was answering himself. "I have absolutely no idea." And for the first time in many years, he found that answer comforting. The manuscript eventually became required reading in some universities and heavily criticized in others. Economists debated it. Technologists debated it. Historians debated it. A few people even read it carefully. Some predictions proved correct. Others didn't. Several companies discovered new approaches that generated meaningful capability improvements. Certain applications transformed industries more rapidly than expected. AI systems became indispensable tools across medicine, engineering, education, logistics, scientific research, and business operations. Yet the anticipated singularity never arrived. Not because intelligence was impossible, not because research failed, but because reality remained stubbornly resistant to simple narratives. The future unfolded as futures often did, gradually, unevenly, complicatedly. The machines became powerful, human beings remained necessary. Years later, commentators would refer to the period as the Great Adjustment. Not a collapse, not a revolution, an adjustment. Society slowly recalibrated its expectations. Investors learned to evaluate AI companies based on products rather than promises. Governments shifted from speculative planning toward practical deployment. Universities stopped preparing students for imminent obsolescence and began teaching them how to work alongside increasingly sophisticated systems. The technology remained important. The mythology faded. And somehow that made the technology more valuable, not less. Nathan retired from Ardent Systems shortly before his 65th birthday. The decision surprised nobody except perhaps Nathan himself. For decades he had assumed he would continue working indefinitely. Research had never felt like a job. It felt like curiosity with funding. Yet retirement arrived naturally. He accepted an emeritus role, continued writing occasionally, mentored younger researchers, and spent increasing amounts of time near the water. Some mornings he walked for hours. Some afternoons he read. Some evenings he sat on the deck overlooking the bay and watched sunlight move across the surface of the water. The pace suited him. One spring afternoon, Emily visited with her family. After dinner, Nathan sat outside with his granddaughter while the others cleaned up inside. The child was 9 years old and intensely interested in everything, especially questions. She pointed toward the stars beginning to appear overhead. "Grandpa?" "Yes?" "Were you really famous?" Nathan laughed. "That's a dangerous question." "Mom says people used to argue about your book." "They still do." His granddaughter considered that. "Why?" Nathan leaned back in his chair. The evening air felt warm. The bay reflected the final colors of sunset. Far in the distance, lights from boats and buildings shimmered against the darkening horizon. "Because people disagreed about the future." The child nodded as though that made perfect sense. Then she asked the question that reminded him so much of Mara that it almost hurt. "Were you right?" Nathan looked out across the water. The answer, he realized, was more complicated than it would have been years earlier. The manuscript had not predicted everything. Nothing ever did. The world had changed in ways he anticipated and ways he never imagined. AI had become more useful than many skeptics believed, less godlike than many enthusiasts expected. Most importantly, humanity had continued. The old assumption that machines would soon inherit responsibility for civilization now seemed strangely distant. People still made decisions, still made mistakes, still solved problems, still created meaning, still argued, still loved, still built futures. The responsibility had never gone away. It had remained exactly where it had always been. With them. Nathan smiled. A little. His granddaughter frowned. A little? A little right. The answer seemed unsatisfactory. Children preferred certainty. Adults usually did too. Eventually, she shrugged and returned her attention to the stars. Nathan watched them with her. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house had become quiet again, Nathan found himself standing alone beside the window of his study. The room looked different now, cleaner, less crowded. The walls no longer held charts and reports. The stacks of evaluations had been archived years ago. Most of the urgency had faded. Only a few books remained on the desk. Among them sat a worn copy of The Human Advantage. Nathan picked it up. The cover showed signs of age, coffee stains, bent corners, faded notes in the margins, the physical evidence of a life spent thinking. He opened to the first page and reread the sentence that had started everything. For 15 years, I have publicly argued that artificial general intelligence was likely within reach. I now believe that conclusion was wrong. Nathan smiled softly. Looking back, he understood that the sentence itself had never been the point. The point was the willingness to write it, to reconsider, to question, to change one's mind when evidence demanded it. That was the real advantage. Not intelligence, not computation, not prediction. Humility. The ability to confront reality, even when reality contradicted hopes, investments, careers, or identities. Machines could calculate, machines could optimize, machines could imitate. But the courage to admit uncertainty remained stubbornly human. Outside the window, the bay stretched into darkness. The city lights glowed along the shoreline. Airplanes crossed the night sky. Boats moved quietly through the harbor. Civilization continued its endless work. No superintelligence had arrived to take over. No machine god had descended to solve humanity's problems. The future had remained exactly what it had always been: a responsibility, a challenge, an opportunity, a story still being written. Nathan stood there for a long time, watching reflections ripple across the water. Then he switched off the light, left the study, and walked slowly toward bed. Behind him, the manuscript remained on the desk. Ahead of him, the future remained unknown. And somewhere between those two realities lay the truth he had spent years trying to understand. Humanity's greatest advantage had never been intelligence alone. It was the willingness to carry the burden of deciding what to do with it.